Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Naylor, a principal consultant at Frontier Advisors. And today I'm joined by John Fagan, co-founder and principal of Market Policy Partners in DC. John, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Much
Uh,
appreciated.
well, it's been, I guess, about 12 months ago that we were sitting together in your DC office talking about things going on at the time, and perhaps how the impeachment proceedings for Trump would play out. When I think about that, and you think, wow, how much has changed in 12 months. I
It
guess
really
now
is
find
impressive.
ourselves leading into the election. I guess I wanted to start off by just saying, like, how are things going over there, and particularly, like, how are you seeing sort of momentum going into November, both for Trump and Biden?
Well, thanks, Phil. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you again, and your clients as well. Really, I think the issue of momentum here is we're coming out of the two big and really unprecedented conventions of the parties. So the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, both went off in mid to late August in a remote and virtual, mostly virtual format, which I think in some ways kind of played to the strengths of the of both campaigns. They had a lot of multimedia and took advantage of the flexibility of the format. Obviously, President Trump also employed the set piece of the White House, something that's quite non-traditional, and there's a lot of discussion about the Hatch Act, which is using your political position for electoral advantage. But I guess there's a fair amount of ambiguity there and nobody really blew the whistle on it. So they both
Well,
came off
not
seeming.
non-standard is maybe something that isn't supposed to be surprising under this presidency.
That's right. Yeah, he came to Washington to shake things up, and he's certainly done that. So the unconventional conventions came off, and Biden obviously got a lift from the anticipation and buildup into naming Kamala Harris as his vice presidential running mate. It wasn't necessarily a very big surprise, but certainly he obviously foreshadowed it pretty extensively, and she was right at the top of everybody's list. So it wasn't a big surprise, but certainly that created a lot of the narrative, and that generated a lot of the narrative that they used in the Democratic National Convention. And then the Republican National Convention, obviously, it was the show that President Trump wanted, and they both came out of their respective conventions with maybe a little bit of a boost in the polls, but nothing really game changing. And I think that we've seen, if you want to give one candidate a little bit of a momentum nod over the other over the past month, it does seem to be President Trump. He's closed the gap to some extent with Joe Biden, although the gap remains relatively wide in most polls. About nationally, about seven to 10 points is typically what you see. What that trend, we'll talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about that, what exactly that translates into. But that's a moderately wide lead, and President Trump has sort of made up the consistent sort of double-digit gap that he was suffering in July has been narrowed to some extent. Some of this is just polls tend to narrow getting closer to voting day, but also he's benefited from a couple of different factors. One is that COVID, the resurgence, or it wasn't debated whether it was a second wave, but really as it made its way into areas outside of the Northeast and California where the initial flare-ups occurred. That COVID outbreak in swing states like Arizona and Florida, that's easing off a little bit, so that's probably benefited his polls. And we've just gotten and when we've obviously had another incident in which of civil unrest, this time in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And certainly both, I mean, President Trump is clearly trying to use the unrest in the U.S. and the social justice protests to his electoral advantage, and Joe Biden is obviously trying to do that as well. But that was an occurrence, I think, that may have bolstered President Trump's law and order calls and so forth. So, but recently it's leveled off. So it's not as though his rebound, President Trump's rebound here, has really been storming.
Yeah. And I want to get into markets and how markets are going to react in a moment. But I guess just on the points we've been talking about, you've had the conventions. There's this momentum change. It seems like voter turnout is going to be a pretty important issue. I guess it's like with the conventions, with the vice president being sort of announced by Biden as the running mate. Is there enough support there for Biden to actually get people out to the polls to actually vote? And I guess, and then how do you contrast that with Trump's sort of ability to really kind of rally his base, even if he's behind in the polls, to kind of make that gap up? So how are you seeing those sort of issues?
Yeah, the voter turnout really is a key issue, and you can certainly see that by the actions of the candidates. In the primary elections that we've seen, clearly COVID is a huge swing factor, and how the states organize their voting makes a big difference in regular times, but it's magnified exponentially in the COVID environment. And so you've seen states that have early voting and mail-in and a relatively heavy reliance on mail-in ballots, those have had relatively larger turnouts than the states that have been, almost entirely focused on in-person voting. It's there's still a lot of concern about, public safety and being able to do things like voting and going out in public safely. I mean, these aren't going to be open air venues. It is going to be inside. We've seen a lot of, recently there are traditionally places that are quite crowded, polling stations with long lines and so forth. Voter turnout really is going to depend on, to a great extent, on how COVID is progressing at the time of the election, the extent to which mail-in ballots are being used, or voters feel comfortable using them, and we'll talk a little bit about that, why that might be the case. But writ large, a big turnout is not a good message for President Trump in this one. Low turnout would fit much closer to his advantage, because he has, as you said, the sort of bedrock support from his base who are going to march out to the polls. It's 40% of the country, give or take, is rock solidly in his corner. He doesn't seem to be able to, his approval rating is like 42%, and he doesn't seem to be able to go much above it or much below it. But that 42% is diamond hard, it seems. And so the swing factor really will be the Democratic enthusiasm and the Democratic ability to get to the polls and ability to have their vote be counted and so forth. So if, obviously right now the controversy, President Trump has raised a lot of doubts about mail-in voting. He has, clearly had and he sort of implicated the post office infrastructure in this, and his postmaster general is is obviously a relatively partisan figure at this point. And so if there's nothing more nefarious than just planting the seeds of doubt in the minds of voters about the mail-in ballots, and Democrats tend to vote much more prevalently in the mail-in format than Republicans. If Democrats don't feel confident now that their mail-in votes are going to be counted or effectively or basically effectively brought to bear in the election in some way, shape, or form, and they instead decide that they're going to go physically to the polls, but on the day of, a lot of things happen and it's hard to get to the polls, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think that's going to be a really big issue. The enthusiasm gap, I think, is very much in the Democrats' favor. It's not because Democratic Party is in love with Joe Biden, but there's an increasingly virulent, well, there was always a relatively virulent, but increasingly intense desire to eject President Trump from the Oval Office, given recent events. So it really is. There are a lot of factors. It's hard to say that it's hard to predict just how these dynamics will play out, and whether the Democratic voters and their enthusiasm can really be felt.
Yeah, and given that how hard it is to predict, and you're talking about the mail-in ballots, maybe that's a nice segue to talk about markets, and it would be good to get your perspective. I guess under the most kind of obvious scenarios around how do markets react under both a Biden win or a Trump win, but I think you sort of alluded to this mail-in and this sort of this other option of, well, what happens if on the night the result is really not clear. How do markets react? And it would also be good to we can kind of touch on how you actually see that scenario actually playing out legally over there in the US, and is there an end point to those sort of things? But maybe starting on the market reactions under both those administrations.
Sure. Yeah, it really, as you say, this election carries a very novel set of risk factors along with. On a typical election, you would have two candidates, and you would have the market favorite, and you would have markets responding to the fortunes of their favored candidate versus their less favored candidate, particularly if the gaps in their economic policies, for instance, were quite divergent. But what we usually see is that the timing, markets don't tend to anticipate even a big election like 2016. Markets didn't really start to price in some of these outcomes until much closer to the election. We're talking, we've just had the Labor Day holiday in the US, which is sort of the unofficial end of summer. And that's sort of the starting gun for market participants to really typically begin to get their portfolios ready for some sort of political outcome in November. But they don't really start, making moves for months. And this, I think, is a year where investors are getting their ducks in a row for this risk a lot earlier, and we're seeing VIX, basically volatility futures for the U.S. equities, showing pretty pronounced upside concerns in basically elevated volatility implied for October, November, and then even persisting for months to come. We'll talk about the elevated volatility scenario of a potentially disputed election. So I think that we're talking about a much, potentially much earlier, pricing in or having to confront these risks. Very often, market participants get they get elections wrong. We saw the market be wrong-footed by the polls going into 2016. Certainly, Brexit was it surprised everybody, or not everybody, but an enormous amount of a broad swath of the pundits and market participants. So there's often a lot of prediction failure, and the prediction failure is market participants and our clients in the U.S. generally accept that they don't really have an edge in the polls. And so they try to, put sort of a blanket, give themselves maximum flexibility and sort of a blanket risk protection potentially into meaningful and consequential elections. So even if Joe Biden goes in with a substantial lead, that doesn't mean market participants will be taking off their hedges and cruising into the election night without a lot of concerns. There's a lot of doubt about the sanctity of the polling. And just lastly, there tends to be a bias toward the Republican Party in Wall Street. No surprise, the more business-friendly, low tax, low regulation kind of formula that has worked for the Reagan era is a favorite of Wall Street. And so it's very common to have the commentary about, well, if Biden wins or the Democrat wins, the markets are going to come off significantly. President Trump has made that point as well. I think in this case, this is another point where this election is quite different. Wall Street isn't really all that frightened about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration. It's hard to map a far left socialist agenda onto the kinds of things that they're talking about, and so the scare story isn't necessarily all that strong. Even though when we'll talk more about Biden's economic policies, he is very upfront about raising corporate taxes back to where they were before the Trump tax cuts. But writ large, he and Kamala Harris are moderates. They've not gone with the ticket doesn't feature the Bernie wing, and the Bernie Sanders, far left socialist wing of the party is behind Biden and Harris, and it's not something that the Biden economic plan isn't terrifying to Wall Street, and the bias toward the sort of reflexive bias toward a Republican candidate. Trump is a little more nuanced because he features such a high degree of policy uncertainty and volatility. There is not a lot of clarity on what his second term really will mean in terms of policy priorities. Is he going to, he's been tough on China up until now. Is he going to be unfettered in the second term, really drop the gloves? Is he going to be, even more unpredictable and volatile and on social media and protectionist, and who knows? So they like the light touch. Corporate America likes the light touch regulation and low taxes, but the policy uncertainty and sort of volatility under Trump sort of shades some of their what would otherwise be a very strong bias towards his program. But
let's get into really the policy in a minute. But what I want to pick you up about this this process about what happens on election night when it's not clear what's going to happen. I mean, I guess you talk to a lot of lawyers over there as well, but everyone must be kind of gearing up for that. What is how do you see that process unfolding? Like, at what point is there a cutoff? Do we ever, is there a moment where we do actually finally get a result in your mind?
Well, this is it. The typical, one candidate versus another risk profile really doesn't apply. The big risk in this election is that the result is delayed, disputed, and potentially leads to some kind of constitutional showdown, accompanied by what a lot of people fear will be civic strife on the streets of American cities. And this is a nightmare scenario for the markets. There's clearly, there seem to be two basic outcomes around which this election seems to be headed. One is a Biden landslide. That is the most clear cut. If he is absolutely, streets ahead, he's winning every toss-up state, every toss-up district is going to Biden. There's clear-cut turnout. Well, there's a potential there that you could have roughly the contours of the result on election night. But even under those circumstances, so many of the states don't start counting mail-in ballots until the polls close, that there are going to be key states that haven't finished their count for days. And so there's a sense that, even in the best case scenario, for clarity, which would be most likely a Biden walkover, there's still going to be some kind of time delay that would force a little bit more uncertainty into the process. A close election, which is considered more likely, it's supposed to be a nail biter and come down to just a few battleground states, and those battleground states are going to feature a lot of mail-in ballots. There are going to be a lot of questions around it. When does the result have to be certified? And the issue really comes down to this: the question of electors. Once they start going through the polls, the states, it's not as I'm sure it's not a straight up majority. Just count the votes and the state goes one way or the other. That's how it seems to work, and that's how a lot of Americans sort of believe that it works. But what ends up happening is the votes get counted, and then the state legislatures have to select the electors, and the Electoral College is what makes the final determination. And so, if there is a long, drawn-out process where the count, one candidate's demanding a recount, or questioning the sanctity of some of the voting and some of the polling, there then there's an issue about who sends the electors to vote in the electoral college, and that really is down to, I mean, that could be a question that is settled at the Supreme Court level. Another, Bush, basically Bush v. Gore scenario that is on a much wider scale and against a much more uh, fraught social and civil backdrop. And that wasn't the Bush v. Gore. Correlation is not causation, but the markets didn't like that long period of uncertainty and weren't sure how it was going to come out. And we definitely saw some risk aversion that analysts ascribe to that degree of uncertainty. If we have an order of magnitude more of that lasting for months beyond, and they have to certify some result by the end of the year, and you end up with competing groups of electors being sent by various states and the Supreme Court having to weigh in while President Trump and Joe Biden, appeal to their bases, and who knows what is going to be happening. It's easy to paint a very chaotic picture of this process. And so when you look at things like equity volatility futures in the US and see that they're elevated in October, and they stay pretty elevated through the end of the year, there's the reasoning behind that, and the likelihood that this drags on into a fully litigated, all singing, all dancing national crisis is well within the realm of possibility at this point, and it's
And in
unfortunate.
that, at what point does it all cut off? Like in your mind, like if you go down the road of the litigation, there's contested result. By Christmas, will we know, a definitive answer, or is this something that's going to, in your mind, could potentially, if it goes to the Supreme Court, spill out for longer than that?
Yeah, in terms of the so I'm looking at it's a very convoluted process, and whether I think that basically if the electors are unable to if the electors sent from the state are unable to form a majority or a viable majority, then it defaults to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is Democrat controlled, but that's not how the voting in this particular case goes. It's by the delegations. So it's basically in the House of Representatives by the states. And the Republicans currently control a majority of House seats in 26 states.
Yeah.
And so this comes down to like one or two seats in the House that could potentially give the Democrat controlled House of Representatives the power. The outcome would be a Democrat controlled House of Representatives electing President Trump. Now, this is, it come down to the wire and be very close as absences due to the coronavirus or just the usual attendance issues, or, the abdications and the concerns of these. Then it's possible that it could go, then it goes into the, potential realm of the Supreme Court, and so the 20th Amendment, I'm reading this because I don't live the constitutional.
Yeah.
This is all like a quick study for us. 20th Amendment dictates that the terms of the president and the vice president end on January 20th. And so at some point there has to be either a decision before that, or then there's a default procedure. The default procedure is if the presidency and the vice presidency are vacant, the Speaker of the House becomes the president, but the representatives are no longer representatives on January 3rd, and so that may default to the Senate. It's an absolute spaghetti bowl of completely untested fallback positions with mutually conflicting sort of ideas. And as I said, this latest one is, if it's January 20th, if the House Speaker is supposed to take over, but the House Speaker isn't, the term is run out. What is a larger election issue that may have filtered down into the House of Representatives races? It's a real rabbit hole, and hopefully we never have to explore these lower reaches of the constitutional requirements and fallback positions for these for the presidency and vice presidency of the United States. But and it's not particularly comforting knowing that these rules are A, untested, and B, arcane, and and leave us with a lot of unanswered questions as to how it really would play out.
Well, I want to switch gears a little bit now, talking about let's talk about like policy.
Sure.
Start with, I guess it would be good to touch on both fiscal policy and foreign policy, but I guess fiscal policy first. I guess in markets, there's a lot of focus on Biden's plan to increase the corporate tax rate. It seems to us that is maybe missing the other side of the policy, which is the spending side as well, and potentially quite a large fiscal expansion under Biden. So, how are you seeing both those issues, both the potential increase in tax rate, but then also spending plans under Biden and how that will affect markets?
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head there. That's the weight and the counterweight that Wall Street is putting out there when they inspect the Biden plan, which is they would rather have the 21% tax rate, but he's made it pretty clear that he's going, if elected, he would raise it to 28%. And that's a rate that corporate America lived with for a long period of time, and may not be what they want, but as you said, it comes along with relatively significant spending plans. The centerpiece of the Biden fiscal plan is $700 billion for basically a build back better, build America plan. It's focused on the manufacturing sector. It's trying to obviously outflank the Trump blue collar appeal, the Trump economic nationalism. This is a place where the Democrats haven't been particularly strong, although they have featured that element in their parties. And Joe Biden has, in the past, he obviously has coming from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he has that sort of working man's and working women's appeal sort of hardwired into his political persona. So it's not a huge departure for him to do this. And it's a $700 billion plan, which, that's an enormous plan, although it gets dwarfed by the numbers for the stimulus, for the COVID stimulus these days. But 400 of that would be a domestic manufacturing push, and basically trying to beef up domestic manufacturing capabilities and infrastructure around that. And 300 billion is for research, and half of that would be for green energy, clean technologies, and so forth. There's also a focus within this on supply chain, strategic supply chain reshoring. We've seen this, it's begun under President Trump. And so and this kind of speaks to the undertone of continuity between President Trump and Joe Biden. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the US-China aspect of foreign policy. But Trump kind of poached a fair number of his policies could have very much been a Democrat agenda way back when. But he took the parts that he favored and ran with them. And the Democrats are finding themselves, with a fair number of things that they don't dislike in his policies. They disagree more with the way that he's implemented them and some of the other priorities around them. But certainly a focus on bringing U.S. manufacturing jobs is now home to the U.S., while shoring up strategic supply lines like pharmaceutical supply lines and personal protective equipment supply lines, things that these are basically an expansion of national security, of the national security understanding into economic security areas, places where it was much more narrowly defined what is national security. Economic security and national security have been conflated under President Trump, and we think that President Biden would continue that idea on those fronts. He unveiled yesterday a plan to give 10% tax credits to companies that were bringing manufacturing jobs to the U.S., and a 10% tax penalty on overseas manufactured, basically outsourced manufacturing. The specific details of what exactly qualifies here under these categories has yet to be specifically defined, but it's a statement of intent to try to incentivize manufacturing jobs to be onshored back to the U.S. And that's really going to be a major centerpiece for his policies. But he's got a lot of other things on his plate, and he certainly needs to approach the social justice aspect. That's a commitment that he's made, and he's also made a commitment to expand the Affordable Care Act, which he was obviously instrumental in enacting in the Obama administration. No one of these things is a small undertaking, and the question of what he starts to tackle first will partly be a question of necessity, really, and given the economic fallout from COVID that will likely be continuing if he is elected, one would assume that he would probably prioritize the spending plans. And then try to get to some of the other, whether it's healthcare and social justice, later in his first term. These manifest themselves in clean energy and clean energy stocks doing well. There's a sense that that a Biden win is priced into some of these stocks. Wouldn't argue against that, but writ large, the idea that markets would disfavor and sell off in the event of a Biden win, I think is something of a stretch. My guess is that if there's a clear-cut result, the markets will have a relief rally, no matter which candidate wins. Clarity of the result's the key.
And you, I guess, kind of wrapped up in that in terms of really either under Biden or Trump, in their agenda, it would seem you've got the presidential election, but there's also House and Senate that they're going up in terms of votes. It would seem that the Democrats are going to, keep the House. That seems to be fairly clear from the polls. But the Senate seems to be, a really interesting one. How do you see the importance of the Senate? Like, if either Trump remains president, but doesn't have control of the Senate and doesn't have the House, or if Biden gets up but doesn't get the Senate, how much will that impede some of those policies you talked about, like the big spending plans on renewable energy?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. I think it's hard to downplay the importance of the Senate, and we've seen Majority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell as a very strong force and a partisan force in the Senate, a body that was traditionally supposed to be the more bipartisan, deliberative, and it's as politicized as any institution in Washington now, and certainly Mitch McConnell has been driving that bus. If a Biden administration is facing down Majority Leader McConnell in the Senate, that's a very recognizable problem. The Obama administration had that for their second term, or for basically through most of the Biden administration. It was not a comfortable place for them to be. It certainly impeded them their progress in a variety of different areas. On these big spending bills, it's possible that you could peel off a couple of Republicans who want some of this spending, particularly on the manufacturing side. But with things like civil rights and social justice legislation, an Affordable Care Act expansion, that would be a pretty tough sell in a McConnell-led Senate. And so the Senate is a really big deal. There are certainly expectations that the Democrats have a path to flipping the Senate. Not in a landslide kind of way, but coming up from their current 47 plus 2 independents. So basically, the they need to basically, depending on who wins the White House, they have to flip 3 or 4 seats, and in that case, they do have a path to do that in some of the states that pollsters are focused on, like North Carolina, Maine, Colorado, and Montana in particular. And so that's a major priority for both parties, either to keep as few seats as flipping if you're the Republicans, or to try to turn a few your way in the Democrat side. And clearly, if there's a presumption that if Biden wins, the likelihood is that enough of those seats flip that bring them to 50, and then the deciding vote is the vice president. So they will have an effective majority. But there is the filibuster in the Senate, which needs a bulletproof 60 majority to override. The filibuster is a powerful tool, and there is a lot of discussion that if the Democrats take the White House, the Senate, and the House, they will override the filibuster to achieve some of their goals if they feel they have to. And certainly it's been brought up. Former President Obama advocated it specifically in the case of civil rights legislation. If the Republican Senate caucus seeks to filibuster civil rights legislation, President Obama recommended overriding the filibuster. There have been other interesting options and ideas about why the Democrats would break. What would cause them to break the filibuster and finally relegate it to the junk pile of history? Another vote that people have speculated about is Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia statehood, as a potential major political swing factor that the Democrats would abandon the filibuster to achieve. Washington, D.C. is absolutely I think that it's anybody who knows Washington, D.C. knows that the district is very Democratic heavy. It's very high percentages of minority population. The mayor, Muriel Bowser, she has faced down President Trump very publicly in the social justice protests that occurred through the spring and summer. She's a clear Trump antagonist, and there's a sense that the Democrats would try to take DC statehood over the line if they have this window of opportunity, and they would junk the filibuster in order to do that. This is all speculation, and it's you have to get through a bunch of different hurdles to get there, but it is that would be a game-changing political situation.
Let's talk about foreign policy quickly. So, I think this will be an interesting. It's an area that's pretty important for Australian investors. It actually wasn't that long ago in markets, although it seems like a long time ago, that markets really were being dominated by US-China trade tensions. I guess we've seen what can happen under Trump, but I guess there is some sense that things may be better under Biden in terms of tensions with China, but it also seems that maybe we're in a whole new paradigm in terms of the relationship between China and the US. So, how do you think investors should be thinking about, foreign policy under Biden, in particular with China?
I think you're right that we're in a whole new paradigm. I think that we subscribe to that view, and we certainly see it on a daily basis here in Washington, D.C. And it's not something that was necessarily, abrupt. The change in attitude toward China in the federal government level. I was still working at the U.S. Treasury Department when President Xi went up for his second term and effectively abolished the term limits. And there was that was a crystallizing moment for basically for government officials up and down the spectrum that I talked with. That was still during the Obama administration, but there was a sense of the convergence thesis, which is the richer China gets, the more liberal, the more democratic, the more reform-minded they're going to be, and the more they are going to ascend into the ranks of a mature power and take their place on as a responsible actor and leader on the world stage in a way, that comports with Western values. Well, maybe that was a little bit much to hope for, but certainly that second term and the abolished term limits for President Xi really shattered the last vestiges of that thesis. And there was a sense that China is now on a completely different path than we expected them to be. And this was a policy pivot that was beginning before President Trump reached office. And certainly as he targeted China on trade and on a variety of different fronts, and we're characterizing this under President Trump as a multi-front campaign to counter China across whether it's tech and tech transfer, investments, trade, supply chain, geostrategic dynamics, human rights. On all of these different fronts, the U.S. is now in a posture that is more or less, to a greater or lesser degree, opposing Chinese initiatives. And where the Chinese want to go with on these fronts, the U.S. is increasingly standing in their way. Obviously President Trump focused most closely on the trade front. It was the most high profile. It was the nearest and dearest to his heart. He's been a trade warrior for a long period of time, and he certainly found a kindred spirit in Peter Navarro and some of the other China hawks in the administration. As the Democrats watched this unfold, the commentary that we heard most frequently was, we quibble with the methods rather than the overall direction of policy. The Democrats were concerned about the what they saw as unnecessary volatility, unnecessary sort of capriciousness, and the brinksmanship, the lack of multilateral outreach that would have built an international coalition that could have pressured China to a more effective degree. And you hear this coming out in the Biden in the Biden platform. He's expressed that very thing, which is, in some ways, he's obviously trying to parry the thrusts of the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, saying that he's soft on China, but he's also got to put together his approach. And he has specifically said that he would pursue a more multilateral approach, but not abandon these kind of these battle fronts in the campaign, the ongoing campaign to counter China. And we think we think that's exactly how it's going to play out. If he is elected, he will have a different style, much more multilateral, probably a less tweet-based approach to diplomacy, less surprises, a little bit steadier, and different set of priorities as well. But the direction of travel, we think, will remain very much consistent. And we think that his focus will be on the reshoring. Clearly, he's made the point that reshoring strategic supply lines and trying to bring manufacturing back is going to be something that he's doing. The institutional machinery of the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, the USTR is focused on a lot of the other fronts. So whether, basically whoever is in the executive office, a lot of these policy measures like the Commerce Department's blacklist on Huawei, that doesn't disappear if Biden is elected. He would have to unwind that. And it certainly seems clear that there's no constituency in Washington, D.C. for going easy on Huawei. The national security apparatus basically finds it absolutely 100% bright line unacceptable to have Huawei equipment in US 5G. Can't happen, and it won't because of that. And so there's a direction of travel there that is consistent. And on the trade front, the phase one trade deal is set. The Trump administration certainly seems to be have no interest in upsetting the balance there, even if the Chinese are lagging some of their targets. We don't think that the Biden administration will tear that one up or offer concessions on the trade front. We think that they will they will let that lie and focus on other areas, as I said, like tech, like the reshoring, and like investment security, whether it's the delisting, eventual potential delisting of Chinese companies listed in the US that don't comport to a higher standard of disclosure, blocking incoming Chinese investment into the US through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, CFIUS, which is a growing arm of the Treasury Department that is greatly empowered and is attracting ambitious young lawyers from all over Washington, D.C. to come in. That's a growth industry. Countering China is a growth industry in Washington, D.C. When I went to the Treasury Department, I'd been in a hedge fund for 10 years, and I always went down to D.C. and asked, the people in various government positions what they thought about a policy and how they were thinking about it and that sort of thing. And I felt like I was getting always good information. But when I finally went into the Treasury and spent 4 years there, I learned almost immediately that learning about how serious a policy direction is only, a very small percentage of that is the good policy idea. A great percentage of it is the institutional resources that are marshaled to push that idea forward. And so when you're in the Treasury Department, you don't ask someone, oh, what are your ideas on this? If to try to gauge the seriousness of a policy, you don't say, well, what's the idea behind it? You say, who's leading it? How big's the team? Are they hiring? Where's their office? Do they have the nice sunny office with a lot of extra space and room to grow? Are they getting big budget allocations? How senior are the people that are in charge? And if you apply that sort of institutional resources and personnel test to the policies that are meant to counter China, it passes with flying colors. When you walk around any of the buildings, the Eisenhower Executive Building, which is the addendum to the West Wing itself, or the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, other agencies you could name, if you saw the parts of the building that were, a heat map of activity and resources of the parts of the building that are, working on countering China, those are the hives of activity. Those are the locuses of money. And that's really where the institutional and the blood is flowing, so to speak. And I think that creates an institutional logic and an institutional consensus that's going to be very hard to break.
Well, I think that's maybe a great place to finish there, John. There's obviously a lot to unpack. Seems like hopefully we get at least a clear answer on the election for markets, and that does seem to be one of the risks that it does drag on there. So, John, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be on. Thank you.